My sister moved into my grandmother's house, took over every decision, and by the time Grandma passed, she'd already convinced the whole family everything in that house belonged to her. For 2 years, my sister controlled every visit. Protect your grandmother, Lily! Get out now! It was never that.
What my sister never knew, what my grandmother made absolutely certain of before she died, was
3 days after the funeral, before a single item left that house for good, my grandmother's lawyer...
My sister took everything she could carry out of that house. What she never understood was that the one thing that actually mattered, the final decision P, was never hers to take.
My sister took everything out of my grandmother's house before the funeral flowers had even wilted. The jewelry, the antique furniture, the family photographs. She packed it all into her own car over 3 visits, telling anyone who asked that she was simply keeping things safe. Nobody in my family questioned her. Why would they? For 2 years, she'd been the one taking care of Grandma. I was just the sister who showed up less. Or so everyone believed. Then, 3 days after the funeral, my grandmother's lawyer walked through the front door of that house with a document none of us had ever seen, and everything my sister thought she'd already won started to come apart. If you've ever watched someone rewrite the story of your own family right in front of you and felt powerless to stop it, I think this story is going to matter to you. And if it does, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit like and subscribe before we start, because there's a lot more where this came from. Let's begin. My name is Lily Hartman, and I'm 27 years old. My grandmother, Eleanor Hartman, was the center of gravity in our family for as long as I could remember. A sharp, warm, quietly formidable woman who'd built a comfortable life alongside my late grandfather, a semi-retired physician, in a grand old Victorian house on Maple Ridge that had been in our family for 3 generations. My older sister Vanessa was 31, 3 years my senior, and had always been the more assertive, more visible sibling in our family, the one who filled rooms with her opinions, who our parents had always described, not unkindly but consistently, as the strong one, which left me, by quiet family consensus, cast as something softer and less consequential. Our grandfather died when I was 22, and in the years that followed, Grandma Eleanor lived alone in that big house, fiercely independent well into her 80s, tending her rose garden and hosting Sunday dinners that had, for most of my childhood, been the one unshakable ritual in our otherwise loosely connected extended family. I visited often in those years, usually alone, usually on weekday afternoons, when the house was quiet enough for the 2 of us to talk properly, without the performance that seemed to accompany any gathering where Vanessa was present. Grandma Eleanor and I had a particular closeness that I think surprised even us. She'd tell me things she didn't tell anyone else, about her marriage, about her own regrets and quiet triumphs, about a version of herself that existed before she became simply Grandma to an entire extended family. I loved those afternoons more than almost anything else in my life at the time. Everything changed when Grandma Eleanor had a fall in her kitchen 2 years before this story begins, fracturing her hip badly enough to require weeks of hospital care and rehabilitation afterward. Vanessa, in what looked from the outside like an act of genuine devotion, immediately volunteered to move into the Maple Ridge house to help Grandma Eleanor recover and manage her care going forward. Our parents were relieved, grateful even, that someone in the family was willing to take on that responsibility, and I supported the decision too, at first genuinely believing it came from a good place. It didn't take long for the good place to curdle into something else. Within a few months of moving in, Vanessa had positioned herself as the sole gatekeeper of nearly every aspect of Grandma Eleanor's life. She managed all of Grandma's mail and finances, just to keep things simple, and began scheduling visits from other family members with an increasingly narrow, controlling hand. My visits, in particular, seemed to require more advance notice, more justification, more careful negotiation than they ever had before. When I did visit, Vanessa was almost always present in the room, steering conversations, cutting off topics she deemed too tiring for Grandma, and on several occasions, walking in part way through a private conversation Grandma and I were having and redirecting us both with the brisk, managerial efficiency of someone running a household rather than loving a grandmother. I want to be careful here because I think it's important to acknowledge something honestly. Caregiving is genuinely hard, exhausting work, and I don't doubt that some real portion of Vanessa's behavior in those early months came from legitimate protectiveness and legitimate exhaustion. But over time, a pattern emerged that felt less like protective caregiving and more like careful isolation. Grandma Eleanor's oldest, closest friend from her decades-long book club mentioned to me once, quietly, at a chance grocery store encounter, that she hadn't been able to get through on the phone in months, that Vanessa always answered and said Grandma was resting, napping, too tired for calls. My own visits shrank from weekly to monthly to, eventually, occasional, always mediated through Vanessa's calendar, always slightly shorter than I wanted them to be. The jewelry started disappearing sometime in the second year. Small things at first. A brooch Grandma had always kept on her dresser, a set of pearl earrings I remembered from childhood photographs. When I asked about them during one of my increasingly rare visits, Vanessa explained, smoothly and without missing a beat, that she'd moved a few things to her place for safekeeping, since people come in and out of this house more than they used to. Grandma Eleanor, present for this exchange, said nothing, and I remember noticing, with a discomfort I didn't fully understand yet, a kind of tired resignation in her expression that I'd never seen on her before. Not confusion exactly, but something closer to a woman who had stopped fighting battles she no longer had the energy to win. Grandma Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep in March, at 89 years old, in the same house she'd lived in for over 50 years. The funeral was warm and well-attended, the kind of send-off a genuinely beloved woman deserves, and I stood beside my parents and Vanessa at the graveside, grieving honestly despite everything that had grown strange and distant between my sister and me in the 2 years prior. What happened in the days immediately following the funeral is the part of this story I still find hardest to talk about calmly. Before we'd even finished the paperwork with the funeral home, Vanessa began systematically moving items out of the Maple Ridge house: furniture, jewelry, boxes of documents, entire sections of Grandma's carefully curated antique collection, loading her car over 3 separate visits, always with some version of the same explanation. She was the one who'd been managing everything. She knew what Grandma would have wanted, and frankly, given the 2 years she had spent as primary caregiver, most of the extended family seemed to quietly accept that she'd simply earned first claim to whatever she wanted to take. My parents, exhausted by grief and conflict-averse by nature, didn't push back. I raised the issue once, gently, at a family gathering shortly after the funeral, and Vanessa's response was sharp enough and delivered with enough confident authority that I found myself backing down the way I so often had over the previous 2 years. Rather than risk the confrontation, I genuinely didn't feel equipped to win. 3 days after the funeral, our family gathered at the Maple Ridge house to begin the more formal process of sorting through Grandma Eleanor's remaining belongings before the reading of her will, which had been scheduled for the following week at the offices of her longtime attorney, a measured, sharp-eyed man named Arthur Nash, who had handled Eleanor's affairs for over 20 years. We were midway through cataloging the contents of the formal sitting room, Vanessa directing the process with brisk efficiency, already discussing which pieces she intended to keep, when the doorbell rang. It was Arthur Nash himself, a week earlier than the scheduled reading, carrying a leather briefcase and an expression of quiet, deliberate purpose that immediately shifted the energy in the room. He apologized for the early, unannounced visit, explained that a matter had come to his attention that couldn't wait until the formal reading, and asked, politely but firmly, if the family could gather in the sitting room for a conversation. What followed reshaped my entire understanding of the previous 2 years. Arthur explained that 6 months before her death, Grandma Eleanor had visited his office alone, without informing any family member, deeply troubled by what she described as a pattern of behavior she'd observed in her own household. She told him, in a recorded conversation Arthur had kept on file exactly as she'd requested, that she'd noticed items disappearing from her home for over a year, that she'd overheard enough fragments of conversation to understand that access to her own life, her calls, her visitors, her mail, was being managed in ways that no longer reflected her actual wishes, and that she suspected, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 89 years learning to read people carefully, that her granddaughter Vanessa's caregiving had drifted into something closer to quiet, systematic control. Rather than confront Vanessa directly, which Grandma Eleanor worried might isolate her even further given her physical dependence on her granddaughter's caregiving, she had instead done something quieter and more deliberate. She had executed a new, legally binding codicil to her existing will, appointing Arthur Nash himself, along with an independent forensic accountant, to conduct a full accounting of the estate's assets, including all jewelry, antiques, and financial accounts, before any distribution to any family member could proceed, specifically naming any items found to have been removed from the household without documented authorization during the 2 years of Vanessa's residency as subject to return to the estate before final distribution. More significantly, she had restructured the actual distribution of her estate. The original will, drafted years earlier, had divided everything relatively evenly between Vanessa and me, with smaller bequests to our parents. The new codicil named me as the primary beneficiary of the estate's financial assets and named the house itself to be sold, with proceeds split according to a formula that explicitly, deliberately reduced Vanessa's share by an amount equal to the appraised value of any items the forensic accounting determined had been improperly removed from the household. Grandma had written a personal letter to be read alongside the codicil, addressed to the whole family, which Arthur now read aloud in that same sitting room where Vanessa had, only hours earlier, been directing the cataloging of items she believed were already hers. "I want to be honest about why I'm doing this," the letter read, in Grandma Eleanor's careful, formal handwriting. "I love Vanessa. I believe she started this caregiving arrangement with real love in her heart, and I don't want anyone in this family to walk away from this letter believing she is a villain. But somewhere along the way, love curdled into control, and I spent the last 2 years of my life slowly losing access to the people and things that mattered most to me, inside my own home, from someone who told herself, I believe genuinely, that she was protecting me. Lily, my darling girl, I want you to know that I saw exactly what was happening to our visits, to our calls, to the small things that quietly disappeared from my dresser. I was too tired and too afraid of losing what little independence I had left to fight it directly while I was alive. So I am fighting it now, the only way I still can. This is not punishment. This is simply the truth, finally allowed to matter as much as it should have all along." I don't fully remember the immediate aftermath of that reading. I remember Vanessa's face draining of color, her composed managerial authority collapsing into something raw and unguarded I hadn't seen from her in years. I remember my mother crying, not for me exactly, but for the specific, devastating realization that her own mother had spent the final 2 years of her life quietly documenting a pattern none of the rest of us had cared enough to notice. I remember Arthur Nash's careful, professional patience as he explained the forensic accounting process that would follow over the coming weeks. Vanessa and I did not speak for nearly 2 months after that afternoon. I want to be honest that some part of me, in the immediate aftermath, felt something closer to vindication than sorrow, and I don't think that reaction was wrong exactly, even if it wasn't the most generous version of myself. But as the forensic accounting proceeded, confirming, ultimately, that a meaningful portion of Grandma's jewelry and several pieces of antique furniture had indeed been moved to Vanessa's residence without documentation, alongside some financial discrepancies in accounts Vanessa had been managing that suggested a smaller pattern of unauthorized personal use, I found myself unexpectedly thinking less about punishment and more about the quiet tragedy underneath the whole story. A grandmother who had spent her final years afraid to directly confront the granddaughter closest to her, and a sister who had, somewhere along the way, convinced herself so thoroughly of her own righteousness that she'd stopped being able to see what she'd actually become. Vanessa called me eventually, in May, and the conversation was difficult, halting, full of long silences neither of us quite knew how to fill. She didn't fully accept everything the forensic accounting had found, not at first. Some genuine denial mixed in with what I came to understand, over several more conversations that summer, as real and eventually unguarded shame. I told myself I was the only one who actually showed up, she said to me once, months later, in a conversation that finally felt honest rather than defensive. And somewhere in telling myself that story every single day for 2 years, I think I stopped being able to see what I was actually doing to her. And to you. I won't pretend our relationship has fully healed because it hasn't, not completely. And I think it's important to be honest about that rather than tie this story up with a bow it hasn't fully earned yet. Vanessa returned the items the accounting identified, paid back the financial discrepancies, and accepted a significantly reduced share of the estate without contesting the codicil, which I think, more than any apology, told me something real about the part of her that was genuinely trying to reckon with what had happened. We talk now, occasionally, carefully, rebuilding something slower and more honest than what we had before, which I've come to believe is probably the more truthful outcome for a wound this specific and this deep. I used the majority of what I inherited to do something I think would have made Grandma Eleanor deeply proud. I kept the Maple Ridge house rather than selling it, working out a buyout arrangement with the estate, and I've spent the past year slowly restoring her rose garden exactly as she used to keep it, hosting the same kind of quiet Sunday afternoons she once hosted for me. Her closest friend from the book club, the one who couldn't get through on the phone for months, comes by most weeks now, and we talk, the way Grandma and I used to, about the version of herself she never quite got to fully share with the rest of the family in her final years. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Sometimes the people who love us most quietly are watching more carefully than we realize, gathering their own evidence even when we believe, in our most powerless moments, that no one sees what's actually happening to us. My sister took nearly everything out of that house in the days after our grandmother's funeral, confident that 2 years of visible caregiving had earned her an uncontested claim to all of it. What she never understood, what none of us understood until Arthur Nash walked through that door, was that our grandmother had already seen the whole story clearly, and had made absolutely certain that the final say would never actually belong to the person who'd taken the most. Wherever you are, whatever quiet erosion you felt happening to your place in your own family, I hope you find your own version of that lawyer walking through the door, the moment someone with real authority finally confirms the truth you've been carrying alone. And if this story meant something to you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one.